Hi everyone, I'm Igor and I'm from Ukraine. I believe during these days following the terrific Russian invasion of my country, a lot of people all over the world were guessing what's really happening in the minds of those who commit, justify, and even support this terror against Ukraine and its people. In order to shed some more light on the mental background the aggressor is guided by committing this crime against humanity, I have interviewed a renowned neuroscientist and psychologist from Dublin Trinity College, Jan Robertson.
Hi, Igor.
I hope that the scientifically grounded information will help you assess the whole scale of danger that lurks in the Russian brain. First of all, Mr. Robertson, tell me please, what in the whole disaster terrified you the most as a neuroscientist?
What terrified me most was really how the individual psychology of one person can play such a huge part in the misery and destruction of so many people. And secondly, how that individual psychology through control of the media can spread to so many millions of other people who follow him.
What is the general problem with the whole Russian nation? I'm not talking about the authorities, I'm talking about the psychology of people because, as you know, a huge part of them support this aggression against Ukraine. How can actually a reasonable person be on the side of terror and death? We are humans and we should cherish like growth and evolution, and this behavior is just against human nature.
Um, Human beings are a group species, and we have very primitive tendencies to favor the in-group. When we do that, we tend to see the out-group as objects where we have hugely preferential instincts towards the in-group. And normally, in a functioning democracy, there are many different sources of information and sources of identity. That means that it's very hard to create an in-group consisting of millions of people. But where you control the information that people are getting, it is with modern technology and with making sure you squeeze out dissent. It's very easy by controlling the information that's going into people's minds to harness these primitive in-group, out-group dynamics in the brain to allow people to see themselves as virtuous, as pursuing a virtuous, even a spiritual journey in terms of preserving their nation. And it's very easy if you control the information to make people feel as if they are under threat, to help demonize the outgroup. So yeah, and the other thing is, of course, Ukrainian and Russian identities at the edges are, there are strong overlaps there, and so there's the threat. So here, one of the features of the current leader of Russia is, and I can explain why this arises, is a narcissism, feeling of superiority, and that narcissism can spread to an entire. If you control the population, you can create a kind of group narcissism, and if that narcissism is much more under threat, if someone who's you perceive to be very like you or even part of you reacts against you or is perceived to not be part of your group identity. And so the rage and the anger is all the greater because it's like, if close friends or siblings fall out, often that's a very much more powerful emotion. The closer the relationship, the more powerful the emotions if there's a break in that relationship. And so there is a narcissism abroad of a feeling of national humiliation from the 1990 and this sense of wishing to regain this glory, former glory.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very easy to create a narrative that these open quotes traitors who are really part of us
Mm-hmm.
are threatening us. And that threat is much greater than, psychologically speaking, than a threat from people who are, of the West, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And so the viciousness and the aggression feels all the more justified because it's perceived to be an internal threat.
Okay, Mr. Robertson, tell me please, how can people believe a pure nonsense? I believe that you heard that Russian propaganda machine is just hard to be taken over, and they are masters of misinformation. But right now they are spreading the narrative as if Ukraine, together with US scientists, developed a so-called armed geese. Yes, the birds, geese. Infected them with a biological weapon, inserted the infrared indicators in their heads to target Russian aircrafts. I think that anyone who could listen to this information would think that it's just insane. But at the same time, I'm listening to the conversations of Russian soldiers with their mothers, and I see that they truly believe that. How can that be possible? Because based on just pure logic, this all is just crazy.
Well, think of this. There are millions of people in America who believe that vaccination, the COVID vaccinations, involved the insertion, a conspiracy to insert tiny chips under the skin in order to be part of a conspiracy to control. This is not, this. If you control the information that people get, particularly you can, particularly uneducated or relatively uneducated people, you can control their minds. You can make them believe impossible things. And I don't believe that the highly educated people necessarily believe these things. But the thing is, one of the reasons that, say, the anti-vaccination people in the USA are willing to believe ridiculous things like the chips being put in their arm is because of it's part of an emotional identity. There's an emotional charge towards identifying with a group that's conspired against, and that's psychologically very powerful and rewarding to feel part of a campaigning group. So there's a huge emotional, the emotion will override in many cases the capacity to say, hold on a minute, let me look up this. Is this possible? Can you get chips injected? So in Russia, there's a huge, particularly because of sanctions and the rest of and being cut off from sport, there is that sense of being a beleaguered, everyone is against us. But we are special. We're a special people. There is that narcissistic group narcissism going on that is deliberately spread by the leader and his acolytes. And so that desire to preserve your self-regard, your concept, that can really inhibit the capacity for rationality and rational consideration of facts, if you like.
Okay, when it comes to the mothers of Russian soldiers that happened to survive in the battles and were caught by the Ukrainian armed forces, in the phone calls, these women pay little attention to the well-being of their own kids, as if they didn't really care about whether they were going to be killed or stay alive. listening to these conversations, even when their own kids try to explain them that everything that was broadcast on the Russian television was a lie. They were telling them that there were no Nazis here in Ukraine. These women were more inclined to disbelieve their own kids. And it seemed to me as if they were just more likely to support the Russian Federation rather than their own children. So, in my mind, it comes into a conflict with nature, because any mother of any creature, of any being, should first take care of the kid. Well, in this case, Russian mothers were just ready to give their kids up for some reason. Why so?
Well, it's a very good question. There was, after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was this sense of national humiliation in Russia, and things were really bad, and there was poverty. And Vladimir Putin created, first of all, he created an economy that was providing more, was better than the 90s. But secondly, and more importantly, he provided self-esteem. He provided self-esteem to counteract that sense of national humiliation, which was both national but personal. And that was what Hitler did to the Germans after the late 20s crash and the humiliation of the Versailles Treaty. Hitler similarly capitalized on a very personal sense of humiliation, and counteracted that with this sense of self-worth again, and then that became into a kind of narcissism. That had these mothers who are probably only watch Russian television, which is just, and I've seen some clips, is packed with aggression, is packed with the most awful things being said about Ukrainians. It's just so full of lies and distortion, but that's all the information they're getting. And if they're sitting in front of their television in their cold, unheated house or not, in a village, and the information they're getting month after month, year after year, this has been going on for 20 years. A phone call from a son in Ukraine, particularly for an uneducated mind, can seem less real, more abstract, just, oh, he must have been brainwashed, he must have been, why is he saying this? So it's very easy to, with the emotional momentum that came from this redemption of the recovery of personal self-worth, because don't forget, I mean, Russia is an incredibly poor country. Most people, 30% of the people large numbers of people without even bathrooms, without running water.
They cannot just connect their poverty and the behavior of their leaders.
No, and that's why dictators usually start wars. Most dictators have to start wars to create the external threat, to create the internal bonding, primitive in-group bonding. And that emotional sense of narcissistic superiority or common cause, that trumps physical hardship.
How can that be possible? For instance, if I don't have the money to buy some food, how can that be even compared to the illusional feeling of being superior to someone?
It's not just delusional. There's a sense of we're all in this together. We are a great nation. We are a great historical nation. we're a spiritual nation. We have the leader of our church supporting this. We are under threat from the world. This is a virtuous cause. Now, that sense of purpose, of common purpose with your fellow Russians, that gives your brain a sense of reward and purpose that is more rewarding than central heating. You know.
What are the backgrounds of the imperialistic inclinations, and can they be regarded as some sort of a mental deviation or even a psychological disorder?
Here's the thing. The reason human beings are a group species, and groups have hierarchies.
Mm-hmm.
And we have evolved that groups have leaders. That's an efficient way for people to cooperate to get common goals. And the reason we have civilization is because we've worked together in groups. That's what makes us so successful as a species. However, over many centuries, people began to see the leaders have power, and power does strange things to the human brain.
This is actually what I wanted to know. What are these strange things power does to the brain?
Power influences the dopamine system of the brain, the reward system, via the testosterone system. Dopamine has an upside down U-shaped function like that. So if you're powerless or relatively low in power, you have low levels of dopamine, mm-hmm. which means your mood is lower, your anxiety is higher, your motivation is lower. So that's what disempowerment is. Mm-hmm. If you become a leader, and this may be an evolved capacity, your brain generates more dopamine via the testosterone system. And up to a point, it makes you bolder, less depressed, more optimistic, less anxious, mm-hmm. more able. It also affects your thinking. It makes you more capable of abstract thinking because the dopamine affects the frontal lobes. So that's, if you like, at the sweet spot. So up to a point, being made a leader actually gives you capacities to do things that you don't have if you're not a leader. So but over the centuries, people realized that this dopamine system can become overloaded if you get with too much power. And if a leader has power, there's a tendency for him, and it's usually a he, to want more power. Because power acts in exactly the same pathways in the brain that drugs like cocaine do. That's why the democracies were invented. Elections, a free press, independent judiciary. All of these things were invented by clever groups of human beings in order to constrain the potentially dangerous effects of power in the individual leader's brain. These are critical external constraints. All leaders, given enough power for long enough, will consider themselves to be indispensable and they start to see themselves, their interests and their country's interests as identical. This happens to all leaders. Now, fortunately, in democracies, we've invented ways of curbing that. All dictators try and dismantle the free press. They try and get rid of fair elections, and they try and control the judiciary in order that they can pursue what becomes for many of them an addiction to power, a little addiction. And the trouble is, when you start to have more and more power for more and more decades, for years, even the Chinese Communist Party, until recently, until Xi came to power, changed their leadership every 10 years because they too recognized that power over long periods multiplies itself and distorts the judgment and the capacities and the emotions of the leader. And that results in predictable changes in the brain and psychologically. The narcissism, the belief that my interests are identical to the country's interests, hypocrisy, rules and laws do not apply to me, they apply to other people, I'm above them.
Mm-hmm.
A narcissistic feeling of being godlike, because you feel so special that you feel that somehow you are spiritually endowed. This is some supernatural
Mm-hmm.
thing that I'm so special. And you know, Vladimir Putin had a 20-meter statue to Saint Vladimir erected outside the Kremlin in 2016.
Mm-hmm.
Julius Caesar had himself made a demigod and put statues up to himself as a demigod.
Mm-hmm.
Kim Jong-un erects enormous statues. That's what dictators do because of their narcissism. But the most dangerous things about this is because of the upside down U-shaped function of dopamine, the power, when you get too much of this, it distorts brain function. And this is what happens to drug addicts and compulsive gamblers as well. Their ability to assess risk rationally goes. And all dictators eventually overreach.
Mm-hmm.
They all overreach because they overestimate their own abilities and judgment,
Mm-hmm.
and they develop a contempt for the judgment of people around them. We saw the contempt with which President Putin treated his Security Council before the invasion. So that contempt arises from that sense of specialness, of special, almost godlike purpose. The compulsive gambler who gambles away his house, gambles away his family's money, is not mad, but his brain is heavily distorted because of the addictive properties of gambling. And power does identical things to the human brain. And so President Putin's underestimation of the Ukrainian capacity to resist, this, predicting that in 3 or 4 days he would have his puppet government in place, and his overestimation of his own forces' abilities is a classic case of the distorted judgment that comes from the pathological effects of excessive power over long periods on a single brain.
How humans with such a syndrome usually end up? What happens to them?
Dictators always create so many enemies that eventually the misjudgments that they make create their downfall eventually. It can take a long time. It happened to Hitler. I mean, Hitler hit the same when Hitler decided to invade Russia, when Napoleon decided to behave Russia. Both Hitler and Napoleon's brains were exactly distorted in this narcissistic way, and it led them to overreach and make very bad decisions. But neither of them would have voluntarily given up. Very seldom do the people with power, because apart from anything else, they're terrified of what happens if they lose power, because there's so many people who they've crushed on their way to power. The more narcissistic you are, the more vulnerable is your ego to any perceived humiliation or slight. It's a very fragile psychological state if you're a narcissist, because you need constant, this huge ego needs feeding, and the slightest sense of being criticized or humiliated or looked down upon is hugely painful. And we saw whatever happened to, Vladimir Putin has had this sense of humiliation since the Berlin Wall fell, but it's grown stronger and stronger. And then the emotions he saw, the anger, which he didn't used to display. Who knows what other factors are playing out there? I can't speculate about that. But so he's He's not. He's not going to suddenly have a change of heart, is my belief.
So, as far as I understand, the longer the person is holding the power, the more damage it does to the brain. So that is the reason why presidents are elected every 5 or 6 years. Am I correct?
Yes. And it's why all dictators try and change the constitution. Most constitutions say a leader can only stay for a certain number of years, and all dictators try and change the constitution.
Mr. Robertson, you have called this syndrome a hubris syndrome. Is that a disease?
It's a distortion of personality and thinking that arises. It's like drug addiction or like compulsive gambling effects. That you see your personal interests are identical to the country's interests.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm feeling victorious, if I'm feeling I've made a success, then the country has had a success. If I'm feeling humiliated and needing to repair that humiliation, the country is that.
So basically, other citizens of the country don't really matter to a dictator.
No, one of the other features of the power syndrome is you tend to treat other people as objects.
That is the reason why these young soldiers are being sent here to Ukraine for inevitable death.
Yeah. It's all about I embody the spirit of Russia. I embody the destiny. It doesn't matter that the country is suffering economically. It doesn't matter because I am the country.